All right, today we are digging into a world that is quite literally right under our skin. We're going to meet some unseen invaders that can take a simple accident in your garden and turn it into a really serious medical situation.
So let's just jump right in. Imagine this, okay? You're out in the garden, maybe doing some weeding, and you get a little prick from a rose thorn. Super annoying, right? You just move on. But could that tiny little injury actually turn into something much more serious? I think the answer is going to surprise you.
Yeah, the answer is a definite yes. And the culprits? Well, they're this fascinating and honestly kind of scary group of organisms called subcutaneous fungi. Now, we're not talking about your average everyday surface level stuff here. No, these are infections that go way, way deeper.
Okay, so here's the game plan for today. We're going to start with the unseen dangers just hiding out in the soil. Then we'll get into the famous rose gardener's curse. After that, we'll tackle two really tough-to-treat fungi, peek inside the lab to see how this stuff gets diagnosed, and then we'll wrap it all up with the key things you absolutely need to know.
All right, let's do it. Section 1, Unseen Dangers in Soil. We're going to find out how these fungi that look totally harmless can become a huge problem.
So the fancy medical term for this stuff is subcutaneous mycoses. All that really means is fungal infections under the skin. And that right there is the key. These aren't quick infections, they're chronic, super slow-moving, and they invade the deep layers of your skin, the tissue below, and can even get all the way down to the bone. And it all kicks off with something called traumatic implantation, which is just a technical way of saying the fungus literally gets jammed deep inside you.
Okay, so who really needs to pay attention to this? Well, the sources are pretty clear. We're talking mainly about rural agricultural workers, or really anyone who's getting their hands dirty with soil or decaying plants. You know, gardeners, farmers, even just walking around barefoot in some parts of the world can put you at risk. And the way in? It's almost always a simple cut, a scrape, or a puncture wound. It's like leaving the front door wide open for these fungi.
All right, let's build on that. Time for Section 2. We're going to look at the most famous example of all of this, the rose gardener's curse. The scientific name is sporotrichomycosis.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, because you can literally see how this thing spreads. So step 1, the fungus, it's called sporotrichomycosis, gets in through that thorn prick we talked about. Next, a little bump called a papule shows up. It's usually painless, but here's the telltale sign. The infection doesn't just stay there. Nope. It starts creating a chain of new bumps, these nodules, that literally follow the path of your lymphatic system up your arm or leg. It's like it's marching along a highway inside you.
But hey, there is some good news for our poor gardener. This curse, and it sounds pretty dramatic, right? It's actually very treatable. The sources say that a round of antifungal meds, usually one called itraconazole, is really effective and usually clears the whole thing right up.
Okay, so that one's treatable. But not all of these fungi are so easy to get rid of. And that brings us to Section 3, where we're going to talk about two really tough-to-treat fungi. This is where things can get chronic and honestly pretty disfiguring.
So let's put these two troublemakers side by side. First up, you've got chromoblastomycosis. This one is caused by these dark, pigmented fungi, and it leads to these slow-growing, really warty lesions. People describe them as looking kind of like cauliflower. Then, on the other side, you have mycetoma. You might have heard it called Madura foot. This thing causes this huge swelling with these deep tunnels or tracts that just burrow through your tissue. And the dead giveaway? It actually discharges these little grains right out of the skin.
And that cauliflower description? It's not an exaggeration. The source material uses this exact phrase: slow-growing, verrucous, or cauliflower-like lesions. I mean, you can just imagine how incredibly persistent and disfiguring that would be as it develops over months and years.
Now, for mycetoma, doctors look for what they call a classic triad of symptoms. 3 key things. First, a firm swelling in one area. Second, those sinus tracts we mentioned, these tunnels burrowing deep inside. And third, the discharge of those grains. And it's so important to get this. These are not bits of sand or anything. They're actual colonies of the fungus being pushed out. It's an incredibly destructive process.
And yeah, the stakes with this one are incredibly high. This is not like the rose gardener's curse. These infections are notoriously difficult to cure. For mycetoma, if you don't catch it early, the sources say you're looking at major surgery to cut away all the infected tissue. And in the worst-case scenarios, amputation might be the only option left.
So how in the world do doctors figure out which one of these invaders they're up against? For that, we have to head into the lab. Section 4.
Inside the mycology lab, time for some microscopic detective work.
When it comes to chromoblastomycosis, there is an absolute smoking gun that pathologists look for. They're called sclerotic bodies. And what's so cool is their nickname, copper penny bodies. Why? Because under a microscope, these thick-walled fungal cells literally look like tiny copper pennies. It's a dead giveaway, the definitive clue they need for a diagnosis.
And for mycetoma, the biggest clue is right there for you to see. Those grains, and I'm going to say it again because it's so important, these aren't just random bits of stuff. They are visible clumps, actual colonies of the fungus being expelled from deep inside the body.
So this is basically the pathologist's toolkit for hunting these things down. They might start with what's called the KOH prep. It's a fast and easy way to see if there are any fungal bits in there at all. To figure out the exact species, they'll try to grow it in the lab on a special culture plate. But the gold standard, the absolute best test, is a GMS stain on a piece of tissue. This stain basically makes the fungus glow, so it's impossible to miss.
Whew. Okay, that was a lot. So let's boil it all down to the essentials in our last section, what you really need to know. Okay, so let's do a quick recap. The big picture. How does this happen? Simple. A cut or scrape gets contaminated with soil or plant stuff. Who's at risk? Mostly people who work the land, like farmers and gardeners in rural spots. What do you need to look out for? Any weird bump or lesion on your skin that shows up after an injury and just doesn't heal. It just sticks around or gets bigger. And the most important part, why does any of this matter? Because getting an early diagnosis is absolutely everything. It is literally the difference between a round of medication and a chronic, disfiguring infection or even an amputation.
And that really brings us to the end of our deep dive. You know, learning about these fungi is such a wild reminder that we are surrounded by and interacting with these complex, invisible worlds all the time. It really makes you think, right? What other invisible ecosystems are we walking through every single day?